Hi, my name is Ike and I make my own clothes, and in this video I want to talk about how I made myself this denim jacket. But first I want to talk about the inspiration. I was really inspired by vintage denim jackets from the 50s and 60s, specifically the Lee 101J and a Levi's Type 3, two of, in my opinion, the most iconic denim jacket silhouettes of the 20th century. What I really liked about the Lee is that these lines of stitching on the front aren't actually seams, they're small tucks that are sewn in, and I think that's just such a cool design feature. What I really liked about the Levi's Type 3 is the fact that the yoke is straight across. On the Lee, it's at a little bit of an angle. I also preferred this pocket shape. It's more reminiscent to the pocket shape that I use for the back pockets on jeans. I also like the width of the waistband. On the Lee, it's quite a bit wider. The backs on both of these jackets are pretty similar, with a center back panel and two side panels, and a yoke. These are all things I wanted to incorporate into my design. For the fabric, I used this 11.5 ounce Selvedge Denim that was woven by Cone Mills here in the States before they shut down production. All of the machine stitching I did in Tech 60 cotton wrapped poly thread, and then all of the buttonholes I worked by hand in this heavy linen thread. And then for the buttons, I used these antique black enameled metal buttons that I got off of Etsy. Starting with laying out and cutting this jacket, I'm cutting this all single layer. I could have probably folded the fabric selvage to selvage and gotten my pieces out, but I sort of like cutting everything single layer. And then I'm just using some weights to hold down my pattern while I chalk around it. I drafted the pattern myself. It was actually based off a pattern that I drafted for a different style of denim jacket I did last year that was an earlier style and slightly more boxy. I also drafted an entirely new collar and sleeve for it. The sleeve on the last denim jacket was a one-piece sleeve, and for this jacket I wanted a two-piece sleeve with some shaping on the outseam. I started the actual construction with the back, specifically attaching these side back panels to the center back, and I'm going to do these with flat felled seams. And the way I like to do my flat felled seams is I'll position them wrong sides together and then just throw in a couple pins to make sure nothing moves. And then I can stitch those. I use a 3/4 inch seam allowance. I know it's a little bit wider than most people use, but I found a 3/4 inch seam allowance to be really helpful, especially on bulky areas like where you have flat felled seams on top of flat felled seams. And then I'll go ahead and trim down one of the seam allowances in half or just under half. In this case, I want the flat felled seams to point towards the side seam, so I'm trimming down the side panel. Then I can go ahead and turn and press that longer seam allowance over the trim seam allowance. And I want the edge to stop just inside my first line of stitching. And then I can go ahead and top stitch down that folded edge to finish off this flat felt seam. I didn't press this flat at all before I started stitching it. I'm just sort of making sure everything is smooth and everything is laying flat as I'm stitching it. I like this second line of stitching to sit just inside that edge. I think it looks a little bit more professional that way. With those side back panels on, I can attach the back yoke, and it's the same sort of process, pinning it wrong sides together before stitching at 3/4 of an inch, trimming one of the seam allowances in half and pressing the longer seam allowance over the shorter seam allowance, and then stitching down the folded edge to finish off that flat felled seam. And then the backs are all together. Starting on the fronts, the first thing I needed to do was put those tucks in. And instead of chalking everything out, I thought it would be easier just to take some measurements off my pattern and fold the front pieces where that first tuck needed to go. And then I just used a ruler to make sure that everything was square before pressing that first tuck in. And then I could take the whole piece to the sewing machine and put in my first line of stitching. I wanted this line of stitching to sit just inside from the folded edge. And then I could flip the whole piece around and put in my second line of stitching. And I just use my presser fit here as a guide to make sure that my spacing was consistent. And then I could take it back to the ironing board for that second tuck. And I knew I wanted the space between the two edges to be 2 inches. So I just measured 2 inches down the whole thing, made sure that was nice and straight, and then pressed it. before taking it back to the sewing machine and repeating the process of putting those 2 lines of stitching in. With the tucks in, I could start working on the actual pocket opening. I'm just turning the seam allowance in half and pressing it, and then I'll turn it again just to finish off those raw edges and pressing it again. Now this was pretty bulky, so you can see I'm putting some pressure on the iron and also using a clapper. I patterned and turned under a seam allowance on the side of the pocket openings here, and I really didn't need to do that. These raw edges would have all been taken care of in the seam that attaches the yoke to the front body, so this was unnecessary and just added a lot of extra bulk. And then I need to stitch down the seam allowance. I just double turned. I'm doing 1 line of stitching from the interior just along that folded edge, and then the second line of top stitching from the exterior just inside the top edge. Next up, I'm prepping the actual pockets before I attach them to the fronts, and to do this, I'm just turning in and pressing all of the seam allowances except the top edge to the right side of the fabric and pressing them. You can see I've chalked a line that I'm pressing to. I've used a seam gauge in the past, and I'm sure you could also just eyeball these, but I've found that chalking a line is the easiest way for me to get a nice consistent seam allowance. Those are then going to get attached to the wrong side of the fronts. To make sure they're in the right position, I'm just double checking that this bottom point is centered between the 2 tucks. And then I'm just putting in a couple pins to make sure nothing moves. And then I can go ahead and top stitch that pocket into place. I'm doing the first line of stitching from the wrong side of the fabric, and I wanted to sit just inside the folded edge. The Levi's jacket that I referenced only has 1 line of top stitching around this pocket, which sort of makes sense. It's a small pocket, and not having that second line of top stitching gives you just a little bit more room, but I really like the look of the 2 lines of top stitching, so I'm just adding a second line of top stitching from the exterior, and I'm using my presser foot to help me maintain a consistent spacing. Before I attach the front yokes, I'm going to make up the pocket flaps really quick, and to do that, I'm just stitching the 2 layers right sides together. And then I like to trim down my seam allowances and clip my corners. This should make it easier to turn and give me sharper corners. And then I like to use this point presser tool just to iron open my seam allowance a little bit. It'll make it easier to turn and make sure that everything is pressed out. And then I'm just flipping the whole thing inside out. I normally like to use the end of a paintbrush to help work out the corners a little bit, but I couldn't find it, so I'm just using a mechanical pencil. And then I'm just going to spend some time with an iron, pressing everything so it's nice and flat. And then I put some top stitching on those. The first line of top stitching just inside from the edge, and then I did a second line of top stitching to mimic the look of a double needle machine. And again, I just used the width of the left side of my presser foot to maintain a consistent space. And then I put buttonholes into the pocket flaps and the side adjuster tabs. I did these by hand, and I'm planning on making a whole video about how I sew these. And then I can attach the front yokes. I'm just making sure to line up that front selvage edge. And I'm actually not going to stitch the pocket flaps in quite yet. And I'm just doing these seams like the rest of the flat felt seams on this garment. So pinning them wrong sides together and then stitching at 3/4 of an inch before trimming down one of the seam allowances in half or just under half, and then folding the longer seam allowance over the shorter seam allowance and pressing it. And then I pressed it flat. The area over the seam allowance of the pocket is very, very bulky, so I took a hammer to those areas to help flatten them. Before I did the second line of top stitching, you can see I added the pocket flap. It only had a 1/4 inch of seam allowance on the top edge, so I could just position it underneath that flap and then catch it down with this top stitching. This was tricky, and I had to redo the seam a couple times to get it to look nice. With the front yokes attached, I could fold in the front facing, and I just did this by taking a ruler to measure out the width it needed to be and then pressing it in place. Before I stitch down those facings, I want to deal with a bit of the neckline that's not covered by the collar. I'm going to stitch the collar on at 1/2 inch, so I just clipped in and I'm turning and pressing 3/8 of an inch, That way, when I sew the collar on at 1/2 inch, it'll sit down onto the body just a little bit. You could totally sew this right sides together and then flip it, but I found that I can get a sharper corner this way. And then I could go ahead and stitch those front facings down. I used the selvage edge here, but you could totally use a folded edge. I'm just following along the selvage and stitching from the wrong side. And then I could close up that bit of the neckline with some top stitching, starting in the seam allowance so it disappears under the collar and stitching to the center front. With that all done, I like to put the buttonholes in at this point, which finishes off the fronts, and I can attach them to the back at the shoulder seams, and I'm going to use flat felled seams here as well. And then I can start prepping my collar to attach it. I'm doing a one-piece collar with a fold at the outer edge. And the first thing I'm going to do is turn and press in the seam allowances at the center front. And then I'm also going to turn and press in the seam allowance along one of the neckline edges. And then I can press the whole collar in half, making sure the center fronts are aligned and that bottom folded edge is matched to the seam allowance. With the collar unfolded, I'm pinning it to the body of the jacket, right sides together, starting at the center front, just matching and pinning those. I've also given myself some chalk marks at where the shoulder seam should end up, so I'm matching and pinning those as well. And then I can put some pins in between all of those to make sure that everything is distributed evenly. And then I can go ahead and stitch that collar on. I didn't get any footage of this, but the next thing I did was press the seam allowance of the neckline up towards the collar, and then everything should just sort of fall into place. And then I like to go around the edge of the collar with a line of basting stitches just to make sure nothing moves. And as I'm doing this, I like to double check that that bottom folded edge is sitting just over my first line of stitching. You could totally use pins here, but I like basting. I found it lays a lot flatter. And then I just top stitched all the way around the edge of the collar to close everything off. It should catch all the layers if everything is lined up properly. I did have to restitch this at least once. I think my issues were not being diligent enough when I was turning in the center front edges to make sure those were properly aligned. And I also think I didn't sew this on with a completely consistent 1/2 inch seam allowance, and that caused some issues. With the collar on, I could start working on the sleeves. I'm doing a two-piece sleeve with a vent. You can see on the undersleeve, I've patterned on a small extension to facilitate that overlap. I did basically half of what my seam allowance is. So in my case, I'm doing a 3/4 inch seam allowance. So I patterned on a 3/8 extension to that undersleeve. And then I'm going to clip in at the top of the vent 3/4 of an inch so I can double turn those seam allowances and press them. And then I can put a single line of top stitching down both of those edges to finish them off. And I'm going to stop right where I clipped into the seam allowance. With the edges of the vent finished, I can sew up the rest of that seam, and I'm actually going to do this one right sides together. Unlike how I do the rest of my flat felled seams, I just find it easier to get everything aligned. And then I can go ahead and sew up that seam. I'm using a 3/4 inch seam allowance here, and I'm going to stop just inside the fold for the vent of the upper sleeve. And then I'm going to go ahead and trim the seam allowance just of the upper sleeve in half or just under half. And then I folded the longer seam allowance of the undersleeve over the trimmed seam allowance of the upper sleeve and press that. And I want the edge to stop just inside my first line of stitching. And then from the exterior, I top stitched up that seam, keeping this line of stitching just inside that edge. And I didn't press this flat at all before I brought it to the machine. I'm just sort of making sure everything is laying smoothly as I'm stitching it. And then once I got to the top, I flipped the whole piece around and came back down the other side of the seam allowance. I could sort of feel where the folded edge was underneath the fabric to make sure I was catching it. but it was also pretty consistent with the width of my presser foot. As I got to the bottom here, I just made sure that that vent was in the right position as I got close to it. And then I just stitched back and forth across the top of the vent to mimic the look of like a bar tack and provide some reinforcement in this area. With the back seam of the sleeve done, I can set the sleeves. I'm doing these right sides together, and I'm starting by matching the top of the sleeve and the shoulder seam and pinning there, and then on the front, matching the underarm seams and pinning. I want the front of the sleeve to be smooth, so I'm pinning that first, making sure everything is laying flat. And then I'm matching the underarm seam at the back and the back yoke and back sleeve seam. This sleeve was patterned without any ease, though there always ends up being a little bit. I just worked it out under the arm here. And then I could go ahead and stitch those sleeves on. I'm using a 3/4 inch seam allowance here, going slow and making sure that I'm not ending up with any puckers, moving the whole garment as necessary to make sure that everything is laying flat. And then from the exterior, I press the seam allowance towards the body. I've got a tailor's ham underneath here to help me negotiate some of those more complex curves. I'm also pulling just a little bit to make sure that everything is smooth. And then I trim the seam allowance of just the body side in half or just under half all the way around the arm's eye. And then I turned the longer seam allowance from the sleeve over the trim seam allowance of the body and pressed it, stopping the edge just inside my first line of stitching. On really bulk areas like the top of the sleeve, I put a little bit more pressure when I was ironing it, and I also went back and hammered those seams flat. And then from the exterior, I'm just putting in 2 lines of top stitching. The first one sitting right along that seam line. There's some complex curves here, so going slow and moving the material to help negotiate those curves is really helpful. When I'm putting in the second line of top stitching, I'm trying to catch the folded edge on the underside. As I'm stitching, I can sort of feel where it is, but also I've patterned this, so it should be the width of the left side of my presser foot as well. With the sleeve set, I can sew up the side seam and underarm seam in one go. I'm pinning these wrong sides together because I'm going to do a flat felled seam, making sure to match up the hem and the arm's eye seams and the wrist as well. The first line of stitching is not much different than the rest of the flat felled seams on this garment. I'm just stitching it at 3/4 of an inch. Then I'm going through that same process of trimming one of the seam allowances in half and turning the longer seam allowance over the shorter seam allowance and pressing it. I did go ahead and press this seam flat, unlike some of my other flat felled seams on this garment. It's because sewing the second line of top stitching here is going to be tricky, and I want to make sure this thing is as flat as possible before I put it on the machine. Because we're sewing what is essentially a closed tube at this point, putting in the second line of top stitching is pretty tricky. So what I'm doing is basically, I'm almost like turning the sleeve inside out, making sure everything is clear underneath the machine, and that allows me to stitch for at least an inch before I have to readjust. Again, sort of just turning the material inside out, making sure everything is clear underneath the machine, and then I can take a few stitches forward. It got pretty difficult once I got close to the arm's eye, so I took the whole piece out of the machine and restarted underneath the arm's eye. It's easier going the opposite direction from the hem to the wrist, and I was able to do that side in one go. Next up is attaching the cuffs, and I'm pinning these right sides together. I put a mark where the seam allowance is on this front edge, and I'm matching that to the front edge of the cuff on both sides, and then putting some pins in between there. I'm using the selvage on the inner edge. And then I can go ahead and stitch those cuffs on. I'm using a 1/2 inch seam allowance here. It really doesn't need to be any bigger. I like to flip the whole sleeve inside out and stitch it with the cuff on top. Next up, I'm going to press the seam allowance up towards the cuff, making sure that everything is laying flat. And then I can turn in the seam allowance on the edges of the cuff and press it, making sure that edge is wrapped over the seam allowance of the front. And then I can turn and press the whole cuff in half, and I want the bottom edge here to sit just over my first line of stitching. I also like to double check that these edges are aligned so everything is caught when I go to top stitch this. And then just like the collar, I like to put in a line of basting stitches just to hold everything in place. To close off the cuff, I just top stitched all the way around it. I decided to start and stop on the undersleeve, that way it was a little more hidden. Next up was the waistband. I did this one with the selvage edge as well. It's actually sewn much the same way as the cuffs. The only real big difference here is I marked out where the seam should go. That way when I was pinning it, I could make sure that everything was aligned. And then just like the cuffs, I stitched the waistband on at 1/2 inch, pressed the seam allowance towards the waistband, turned and pressed in the front edges, turned and pressed that whole waistband in half, and then I ran a line of basting stitches just to keep everything in place before running a line of top stitching all the way around the waistband to close it. And then I went ahead and added those side adjuster tabs I had made earlier. I honestly just sort of eyeballed the position of these, but I knew I wanted them in line with the side seam and sort of centered on the waistband. To sew those on, I just top stitched a rectangle starting and stopping at the same corner. And then I did the last couple of buttonholes on the waistband and cuffs before marking out the placement of my buttons. I'm using a chalk pencil I got at an art supply store to mark these, and I'm just using a ruler to double check that that center front edge is straight. To sew the buttons on, I'm using the same heavy linen thread that I worked the buttonholes in. I don't like to tie a knot if I don't have to, and I found that taking 2 stitches through the same spot will anchor it. And then I'll just stitch back and forth through the button. And this thread is heavy enough, I found I only need a few passes in each direction. And then I like to do what's known as a thread shank, so I'll pass the needle up from the wrong side and wrap it around the stitches a few times before passing it back to the wrong side. And I do like to tie a knot here at the end just to make sure that button is really attached. And then the last thing I do is attach this label that I made. It's my initials cross-stitched by hand in blue silk on a bit of hemp canvas, and I'm just attaching it with a herringbone stitch. And here is the jacket on. I love how this thing turned out. Though I always feel like there's things that I might have done differently. I feel like on this, the waistband could have been just a little bit smaller. And some of the stitching I think could have been better as well, especially that yoke seam. But considering it was the first time I did something like this, I'm pretty happy with how this jacket turned out. But let me know what you think and let me know if you have any questions as well.